Greetings, everybody. My name is Liz Ryerson, and this is the 25th episode of Beyond the Filter. Yes, that's right, number 25. Slowly but surely making our way into double digits. Anyway, for this episode, I asked the Honorable Justin Charity to return, and we had a more free-form sort of discussion about politics, pop culture, music, video games, etc. than usual. So I hope you enjoy. So to start out with, Justin's going to introduce himself.
I'm Justin Charity. I'm a staff writer for The Ringer. I write about music and politics and popular culture and bullshit and nonsense. And I am a podcaster. I'm a co-host of a podcast called Damage Control, which is loosely about things people are angry about online and offline. And
a podcast about things that people are angry about? Wow, you guys really have it. That's some innovation. Silicon Valley level innovation right there.
It's true. I like rage. I'm sorry. I like thinking about the dynamics of rage, because I think people are condescending online a lot of the time when they talk about like quote unquote outrage culture. But I do think it's legitimately fascinating the ways in which so much culture seems designed to exploit people's, I think, anxieties and their boredom and all sorts of other things, and just make people angry for what seems objectively like no reason or out of like completely malicious reasons. I don't know. I think it's fascinating. I think rage is more fascinating than people give it credit.
Well, the problem that I'm sure you've come up against too is that like if you interrogate that to a certain point, people become a little bit more uncomfortable, especially like when you're talking about media. You're challenging the notion that we should be investing too much in these media figures to begin with, and coming from the perspective of somebody who's like a media critic, I'm sure that makes your colleagues uncomfortable sometimes, or I've witnessed it making them uncomfortable, I should say.
Well, in what sense? Like, what's a good example of that?
I don't know. Like, I listened to this podcast episode that you were on that was really good. It wasn't on your podcast. I can't remember what it was. Somebody mentioned...
Was it The Relentless Picnic?
I think so. Yeah, somebody mentioned the goop in your grunge thing, which I'm still laughing about. Because that's like it's this like piss take on like a Pitchfork review, but it's like it's perfect. I don't know. I'm actually really I'm amused, and I think this is the thing that we can like get into talking about. But I feel amused about the differences between. I mean, I guess I could say generally just like new media and old media, but like more specifically. From my perspective, coming from sort of video games world, the media landscape is actually, I mean, it's the same in some ways, but it's actually quite different in a lot of sort of crucial ways to other forms of media. Like, I think music, the music industry, the movie industry, the art world, like a lot of them have these sorts of patterns that are kind of interchangeable between them, but I don't think it necessarily applies as much to games, and I don't necessarily think that that's a good or a bad thing. It's just a result of like a landscape being newer or whatever. I feel like I totally changed the subject from what you asked me.
What about rage? I mean, we can cover a lot of ground, Liz. We got time today.
By the way, you're my first repeat guest, and this is the 25th episode, so it's a perfect.
Nice.
The famous Justin Charity, the esteemed Justin Charity. No, I mean you were all over when Kanye West thing exploded. You preempted it with your opinion by a day, like.
Oh, right. Wait. I'm trying to remember. It feels like it happened 4 years ago at this point.
Yes.
Was it? I think the moment Kanye West returned to Twitter during the period where everyone's like, Kanye's back. This is great. I was like,
And he's
fuck
like,
this.
he's doing this like, well, he was doing this like kind of like mindfulness meditation type talk, like this very like new agey like self-empowerment stuff. And it's like things that I didn't really necessarily disagree with, honestly. But I knew that like something else was probably going to be coming, so I'm like kind of. And then you made a tweet that you said like it's amazing how like music criticism fanficked Kanye out of being a Trump supporter, but
Or Taylor Swift. It was
but fanfic
fanfic
Taylor Swift into being a Trump supporter, yeah. And then
Yeah.
like a bunch of people had were commenting on that. And then like a day or two later, Kanye's like, yes, I like Trump.
That was yeah. Oh man.
So you had the moral high ground.
Listen. Uh, having the moral high ground about like rappers is the
I know.
that's my life, I guess, but,
I'm partially joking, but still like in the take economy, I feel like you're at the top right now. You're at the top of your game.
uh except for the fact that it means that I have to keep writing about Kanye West now, which feels like a sort of nadir.
Yeah, that is really unfortunate, and I was like not going to bring that up, but I already brought it up.
I got to vent. I got to vent. That's why I'm here. I got to vent.
Yeah, well, yeah, like I mean, the obvious point with you know, with any entertainer like that is it's a bad idea to invest in their public image or persona, especially when you're like sort of selectively ignoring a lot about their image or persona. Um, but I like, cause like it's you like you don't have to look very hard at Kanye West to see he's like kind of a reactionary figure. Um, in the way that he's like approached his music and stuff. And I think like the main point that I was like that was rattling around in my head here that I wanted to make here is that I think with musicians especially, um, people don't know how to express or talk about when a piece of music like works and when it's good. Like for example, in like a lot of Kanye West tracks, there's like an effective use of sampling or whatever, or it's like the tracks are like fairly well conceived and well produced, and they're doing something a little different, and like that is something that should be celebrated. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why like like Lemonade for example, I keep fucking mentioning that. I apologize to everyone, but like that's that's why that album is good to me because it's like or at least like from a personal standpoint. Obviously, this is not the only way to look at it, but like I think there are really sort of brilliant sort of musical elements that are coming into play, and people don't really necessarily know how to articulate that or express that or celebrate that. So instead, I think people are more likely to empathize or sort of invest in these characters than know how to
Right.
express like, oh, this piece of music is good and this person is good at doing this.
Right.
And this thing that I was worried about, and I guess it's come up again with like Grimes now. Because she was dating Elon Musk.
Yeah. How do you
Musk.
feel about this? How do you? Because I've seen you tweeting. I've seen everybody tweeting about
I mean
Elon and
I'm sad. But but the thing is, I was not a fan of Grimes until like her last album, and then I sort of came on board. Um, I mean, like it's easy to project any kinds of ideas or motivations or ideologies onto these figures in a way that's like really difficult because especially the more sort of successful you are in a particular career, the more that your sort of way of looking at things is insulated into that career path. And so you have like very bizarre, you're more likely are not aware of what's going on in the world just in the way that like Kanye was not aware that there was like a Muslim ban. Um, sorry, go ahead. Were you saying
no,
something?
sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay. But it's like I feel like that reality that a lot of these celebrities live in is pretty insulated, and so and that's just a inherent part of being that type of person. Um, and yeah, like sometimes I'm like, fuck all celebrities and rich people or whatever, 'cause like it's hard not to feel that way sometimes. But I think like the thing that I worry about is like risking like when someone sort of becomes a reactionary figure being like, oh, okay, their music was always bad. Like these weird revisionist takes. Um, I feel like Taylor Swift is a good example of that because I never was super into her music. And I never saw what was so bad about that track that everyone said was terrible. And I feel like just public opinion shifted on her somehow. Um,
Yeah, Taylor Swift is actually, I think she's a doubly interesting example because she's both an example of sort of overnight revisionist takes sort of pouring out of the woodwork from not just random people on the internet, but from music critics. So she's a good example of somebody who was recently the subject of revisionist takes, and she's a good example of someone who I think is just like critics' reasons for turning on her. I don't think critics could actually explain to you in a very coherent way. Like if they were trying to account for the shift in their thinking, what they would tell you would be a bunch of things about her being like a Trump supporter allegedly, and it would be a bunch of shit that you'd listen to and be like, wait, what? What does that have to do with anything? Like
Also,
this, one, it doesn't sound true, and
there's like no
two,
proof for that. I haven't seen any political statements that she's made in the last
there's more
whatever.
evidence to the contrary than there is in support of the thing, in support of the observation that supposedly led a lot of people to turn on Taylor Swift.
It's this weird like ritual sacrifice impulse that people have with celebrities. Like it just like it's hard for me to not um I have trouble with the fact that people can't recognize and identify that they're doing this or they just don't really care. But this idea of like building somebody up way more than they should be and then and then tearing them down way more than they should be.
Right, and it's weird because even that phrase, like that phraseology right there, it seems it's so familiar as to read like a cliche, and yet what you're saying is totally true that people just don't acknowledge when it happens that it's a generic phenomenon that's happening and not actually any sort of specific response to any specific thing in a lot of cases. And
Yeah,
it
I
does seem animalistic, or if not
yeah.
animalistic, it seems ritualistic.
I feel like, contrary to like a lot of the people who would say that things have like, actions and actors have heightened political significance and there seems like everything seems hyper important now. I feel like oftentimes people are more reactionary now, and what that means is that things that we were already inclined to do, we're just doing them like 5 times as intensely. Um, yeah.
Wait, what's an example? I'm trying to think of an example in my life that I'm doing 5 times more. Am I tweeting more intensely?
Well, I'm just like I was kind of a light leftist, I guess, before left
Okay,
Twitter became a thing,
right.
and then it's like I get mad about Russiagate, for example. So I keep posting about like why are people fixating on this is a really bad idea, and then the people who are really into Russiagate are like, oh my God, we need to post more about this. I need everyone to see, and it's just like. I don't know. It's this in like increasing sort of
Yeah,
cults.
the pro Russiagate stuff is interesting because that to me, that's an online culture that really has recruited a lot of people who you would think would have better things to do for most of the week into a weird. They think they're part of this weird shadow investigation in the basement of the FBI where it's like they're looking for clues too. And it's just like, what is this? I watch those people interact with like an Eric Garland on Twitter, And these people, I mean, they really are sort of anti-bizarro Snopes.com, right? Where they spend all day churning out text, right? Like text of just nonsense. That's intense. That is definitely an
I
example
mean,
of a take that.
it's basically political fan fiction, right? Like to contrast with the pop culture fan fiction that we have everywhere.
Right. Totally.
I don't
How do
know.
we get rid of all this fan fiction? I Here's the thing though. I used to love fan fiction. What happened?
Well,
Why
fan
did
fiction is fun when like people say that it's actual fan fiction, like they acknowledge
right?
it.
That is a key part of fan fiction culture, I guess.
Also,
Is all of
like
us acknowledging that it's fan fiction.
all of that like bizarro Sonic fan fiction feels so much more pure and good than anything that
Yes.
is. Uh, Somebody posted, or this was back when like Twin Peaks was on the air. There was this clip of the like David Lynch and the investigators, the like FBI investigators were watching this video, and David Lynch reacts and is like, "What the hell?" Um, and then somebody like superimposed this like famous video of this guy being like, "Here's the hottest characters in Sonic the Hedgehog, one of the most attractive characters." and and that was my favorite. I feel like I feel like the Russiagate stuff appeals a lot more to older people of a certain the people of a certain
Yeah.
age. Um and there's this like I think it's like is an inability to understand like how culture has changed, how information is different, it's also an inability to acknowledge that maybe like our institutions were not functioning with the degree of effectiveness that people in certain degrees, certain parts of insulated realities where they didn't have to face this stuff as much, were able to see. So I think it's like it's a natural reaction to be like, let's suss this out and let's kick these crooks out of office or whatever. Um, and I think like because of that, like a lot of this other stuff that is there are a handful of people out there who have like minimal to no expertise. Someone like Eric Garland who can still say that he has more political knowledge than the average person. Which I don't even know if that's true, but because he was like some kind of consultant or whatever, can be like, hey, look, like I know how these things work. I understand game theory or whatever. Um, and people are like, oh shit, this guy's an insider. He knows.
Right.
And so it's kind of it's kind of abusive, honestly. It's like these people like are taking advantage of this sort of confusion and fear and in a really weird way and leading people in all kinds of like bizarro directions with it.
Yeah, and it's weird too because I mean, I don't know, so much of the current decade and the current year, I always have to gut check myself and remind myself that, oh, like American political history's always been weird and bizarre in certain ways. And so, yeah, on the one hand, I remind myself that people have always been hot and bothered and unreasonable about democratic politics. But it is also true that the media and the channels and the communities that people have formed to play out all of the drama and all of the fan fiction of contemporary political culture just seem unprecedented in various ways in terms of their dynamics, in terms of their influence.
Well,
That's what seems stressful to me about it.
yeah. Well, the thing that I find really bizarre is like, there's a lot of people have sort of disproven the idea that history is shaped by great individuals or by great men, by great individuals. I mean, I do think that like certain individuals can have much more power to sort of shape the course of history, but it feels like it feels like basically we're in this point where this cast of like rotating characters, it's about 20 people, is like sort of defining everything about our popular culture, and they sort of come up in weird way. It's like Kanye West and Elon Musk and like Donald Trump and like, like a handful of these other people, and like reality feels really weirdly small, but in this way that's really bad. um, because it's these same people who are like honestly probably utterly clueless about like many aspects of the world, who have like so much power and probably don't even understand that they have that much power. um, some like Kanye West's whole image is like, wow, I have so much power, or it's sort of like playing upon that in various ways. But I think even he like probably doesn't understand, or probably minimizes in some way the amount of, or maybe he doesn't, I don't know, maybe that's not a good example, but like most people who are in that situation, you have to still see yourself and act like a normal person. um, and I think of this in terms of like the tech world in particular, where there's this like sort of perpetual underdog uh, view to everything, which is just increasingly like has nothing to do with reality because the tech world has so much power over everything right now.
Right.
Um, but I think it's really common for people in those situations to sort of minimize the amount of power that they have, because if they had to deal with reality, it would be horrifying. Like they would have to acknowledge that like it is really bizarre that a person in their situation really actually has that much power, um, to shape culture and everything. And that's almost scarier to me than someone who's like a megalomaniac. Although there are like people who are megalomaniacs out there, because it's like it's the more sort of human side of like I don't understand, like basically refusing to acknowledge the things that are like on their face, the fucked up aspects of our culture, and refusing to acknowledge like the horror of just the fact that like so few individuals define so much about like our public life, from politics to celebrities to the tech world, etc.
I feel like a thing that's hard to pin down is so on the one hand in that scenario, right? It's the if you're one of the 20 in that cast of characters, like you said, you're sort of avoiding confronting the reality of having as much influence as you do. But it's also there's sometimes when I locate the influence and the power in that member of that cast of characters that is the American narrative, and there are other times when I locate it in media, right? Because like the fact that the cast of characters even is who it is, that it's like Beyonce, Donald Trump, Robert Mueller, Kanye, you know what I mean? It's there's a reason why it's that cast and not like I don't know Mohammed bin Salman, and like there's a reason why that cast of characters, why one of its more subtle qualities is that it is this very insular American, sort of the rest of the world doesn't exist, and America effectively exists as this sort of closed stage play.
Hmm.
Because to me, that is very much what American politics right now would have to look to somebody standing from like a third person perspective, right? Because it's this if you contrast how Americans thought about politics in the previous decade, a lot of Americans were like feverishly obsessed with the rest of the world, right? Like after 9/11. And now we're in a decade where no American cares about anything happening outside of again that cast of 20 and that sort of like national narrative.
Yeah.
And I think those two things are I think the phenomenon of how we sort of think of the American narrative right now and who the stars of the American narrative are is very much in conversation with the fact that America has sort of closed its political imagination to the rest of the world.
It's such a self-parody. Like it's like that band that you liked. It's is now releasing like 20 albums a year of self-parody. I'm thinking specifically of the band Guided by Voices because I used to be a big fan, and like then they like had a they had like a final tour or whatever. They broke up, and then 8 years later they reformed, and within like 3 years released like 8 albums, and they all sound exactly the same and are not good.
Oh,
That's like that's the self-parody.
that's how we
Um,
all go out. That's how we all go out, Liz. Memento Mori.
that's what happens when you're like forced to double down on your takes.
Right, right. No, that's exactly.
Well, when I heard the Kanye West like Poopa Loop thing, that's what it made me think of because like this is somebody who has been called a genius enough times to where he might actually think that that's a really smart thing that he's doing.
Right.
Like people are
Like a
like,
really
"Oh no, he's
subversive.
just trolling." But no,
Right.
I don't think he's trolling.
Poopity scoop. Well, what do you think he's doing?
Well, I think he's doing the same thing that he did on that song 30 Hours where he just
Yeah.
decided to like spend the next half of the song being like, "Yeah, this is going to be great when I put more stuff on
Yeah.
it."
That is, and I love 30 Hours. I would say I love 30 Hours. You're right. He's like talking to Andre 3000. He's like talking on the phone at one point.
And he's like
His manager.
there's one part where he's just like and then I'm going to go places and then do other things and yeah. That's what that makes me think of. That's what it's like increasingly sort of weird and erratic.
Right.
Um, I mean, that's like the end point though. I don't know. I just like I recognize that in like in Guided by Voices. That's because the dude from that band is like somebody who's like, oh my God, he's a genius songwriter. He writes like the best songs, and I feel like that's the danger of calling someone a genius enough times.
Right.
Um, anyway, I feel like we're rambling, but it's all good stuff.
We're not rambling. What we're really doing, I think, is we're hopping back and forth between politics and music.
We're
And I think
pooping
that's
back and
because
forth
we're
forever.
pooping back and forth. I think we're doing that because that is where, I mean, I don't know. That's like the story of my life for the past 2 years is pendulating between, okay, we all have to get serious now. I have to go back to my original journalistic beat, which is politics, and I have to write like captivating, mind-shattering essays to wake America up from its nightmarish zombie state. And being like, no, I guess I should go back to writing about music because I can't take this shit anymore, right?
Well, yeah,
It's
and
like,
you were gonna do more video game stuff too, because that was the original sort of
yeah,
concept or idea of this episode. Because I'm also like, I mean, I have been following music and stuff more lately than I have been really following any game stuff. Partly because like last year, a lot of interesting games, most of which I didn't play because I don't have like a new console, came
mm,
out. But this year, it's like kind of slim pickings in comparison. It seems like. It's at the like as far as like AAA is concerned anyway.
right.
Um,
I've spent so far, or like currently, I'm only really playing the 2016 Doom, and I'm on Bayonetta 2 right now.
mhm.
So I'm not playing new stuff,
The only new
unlike
things
last
I
year.
yeah, the only new things I've seen people posting about is like Far Cry 5, which doesn't seem like a good game.
Yeah, I'm avoiding that. Well, that and people that God of War, right? Which I've also not
Oh,
playing.
I didn't like those games. I only barely liked those games when they came out, and I think that's like one of the quote unquote franchises that I feel like is the most dated to that era of when it was originally from like
Right.
2005, 2006.
That game just has an aesthetic that I feel so snobbish thinking this, but it just has. It's like okay, it's naturey. I don't know. I'm not into this. Like the closest I've ever gotten into that kind of game, funny enough, is like a Horizon Zero
Oh
Dawn,
yeah.
or I guess like Turok is that too. I don't know. It's just
I
that
like
aesthetic of
Turok.
entertainment I don't like. Of like naturey, muscles, gotta do stuff. I don't know.
I like, yeah, I don't know. I think part of it is I grew up with a certain era of games, but I'm just like endlessly researching PS2 games because I have a PS2 here, and I'm like, oh,
Okay.
this one's weird. It's like, cell shaded or whatever. It has like a weird mechanic, or like PS, like that stuff appeals to me like more than stuff that comes out, even if I did have a new console, because of the the 40 hours of gameplay is a threat rather than a promise sort of mindset.
Oh my god, yeah.
That's a that's a phrase from the Catamites, who's a game designer, but that was one of my favorite ideas.
If you have, oh wait, you have PS2, please tell me you're playing Final Fantasy X too, because that's my.
I'm not, because I'm not playing anything right
Ah!
now, but I have a friend who's really into it. My friend Nina Freeman. She's that game is her aesthetic.
Such a good game. That game is great.
I don't know, but the like broader thing about video game stuff is like I'm doing this video game shit for a while, and it feels like an insular world, and I'm frustrated. Um, and then like slowly, I see like reality bending itself to like fit into to like video game stuff just like has grown so massively and encompassed so many other aspects of reality, like silently, like Twitch is bigger than Netflix. Um, and like video games YouTubers are the biggest YouTubers, and like they have more views than like a network sitcom. Um, and like that's the weird thing to me is like um video games like really like have actually a huge impact on our culture right now in a weird way, but like the discourse is mostly like most of the popular discourse is mostly still ignoring that, or like kind of vaguely acknowledging it.
It sounds to me, it makes me think a bit of hip hop, I'll say in the first half of the 90s, where it's like
Hmm.
this clearly, it's not even, well, I'd say the second half of the 90s, where it's not even an emergent thing anymore. It's just here and it's huge. And yet it's still early enough that all of the writing about it is bad.
And
that's that's how I think about
everyone's
it.
still pretending that grunge is a thing, but grunge is obviously like on its way out.
Right. That's the stage. I feel like that's the stage where video games at are currently, is basically where rap or music criticism was with regard to rap music at the end of the 1990s.
Well, yeah, and after the end of the 1990s, like rap music became popular music, and it has stayed that way for like, almost 20 years now.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of Jake Paul in the future.
Oh man.
And like those types of people than we are going to be seeing like, the celebrities that like Kanye or Beyonce or big actors especially. I don't know, like
Once
actors are sorry, go ahead.
no, I was gonna say once Christopher Nolan casts Jake Paul in something, that's a wrap. It's a wrap after that. I'm telling you,
Uh,
I'm calling it. That's how it's gonna happen. That's how the real sort of like middle brow elevation of Jake Paul is gonna happen. Christopher Nolan.
well, see, and this is the thing with like Ready Player One is they're trying to like, they're trying to slowly like preempt. They know that this stuff is taking over culture, so they're trying to like preempt it in like within the context of like the Hollywood studio system or whatever. Um, before the the new media sort of hubs come to dominate and make these industries redundant. I don't know. It's
Right.
weird because I lived in the Bay Area, and like the Bay Area is a place that like obviously I knew tech was a big thing there, but you don't see it mythologized in popular culture to the extent that you do with LA or New York, obviously. Um, and then moving to LA, it's like, of course, I see all these billboards for these TV shows and stuff. Um, and like all that stuff is, the movie industry, the TV industry is here, and yet like culture seems increasingly defined by like things that I was around and experienced in the Bay Area and not like actually here. So there's like all this mythologizing around particular aspects of popular culture that feel less like they're shaping culture, than, other things that still are going largely unacknowledged in like the popular consciousness. And I find that very weird.
Right. It's almost as if despite it is a weird phenomenon of despite how much media um, throws popular culture, like basically devours and regurgitates and redevours popular culture all day and like spreads it out all over all of us as consumers. You would think that that would mean that popular culture, like when you log onto Twitter, for instance, felt comprehensive in some way, and yet it feels the opposite of that, right? It feels like I don't know. Whenever I'm reading coverage of music or coverage of video games or anything, I'm always just thinking about like what the blind spots are. Like
Yeah.
everything feels incomplete, and it's because the
Yes.
things that dominate are so dominant that even in a theoretically infinite sea of content, it's just clear that like there are only really six things that like are part of the mainstream narrative of anything, and then everything else
Yeah.
feels it's like
Well,
mirages. I don't know. It
yeah,
feels like
I
mirage.
noticed that with like so being in video games, like, occasionally there's like an acknowledgement of like film or something in the most like, you know, clumsy way. Um but I was frustrated about how little it interfaces with other aspects of culture. So, I'm looking towards music criticism in particular, and like it's weird because coming through game stuff now, I'm like, I know firsthand that usually like the best selling things on Bandcamp, for example, are like indie game soundtracks or like chiptune albums. Um, and these things are tremendously popular. A lot of people listen to them, and yet they are not acknowledged by basically any music publication outside of like weird outliers, um, like tiny mixtapes occasionally or things like that. But and that's something that's weird to me. It's like, why can't you include this in your conversation? And there's this increasingly like siloed off attitude. It's like, no, we need to preserve our canon. It's like, fuck your canon. Like canons are stupid. Like I have problems with canons in video games. That's why I like want to play games that people say are bad just to say that this game is actually good. Or like that's why like because I used to follow like the opinions. Like with music, it was the worst. Because like music, you have all those like, I mean, it's like the Pitchfork recommended stuff, obviously, but then you have all those like lists of like, 1,001 albums you have to hear before you die, and like, canon, et cetera, et cetera. So you listen to these things almost out of like obligation because like, especially when I was younger, and still male presenting, I like the identity was like, okay, if I'm a music nerd, I have to know about this. I have to know. It's so that I don't embarrass myself in conversations with other music nerds, or so that I understand something that I didn't understand before. And that impulse is fine. That's a good impulse. But like after a certain point, I came back to it and I was like, actually, this conversation is kind of bullshit. Like, it doesn't help me actually appreciate music on its own terms. And I don't even agree with like half of the like, accepted canon opinions. Um, and I mean, I feel that way about games too, and games don't even have like an anti-canon. um, like, everyone accepts that, certain games are, the pinnacle or whatever, and it hasn't like changed that much. But and that's why I like do stuff with like, that's why I wrote like this huge article about like some Doom mod that like, 10 people cared about. Um Or, I wrote a bunch of stuff about Wolfenstein 3D, which is a game that like a lot of people, credit as like their, anytime that someone talks about Wolfenstein 3D, it's like, well, this is the game that launched first-person shooters, but it's not actually that fun of a game or whatever. And like for me, that like I spent so much time around that game that I just, I have to challenge those opinions. But it's not even challenging them on the basis of like, I'm trying to be contrarian, although sometimes I am. Um, but it's more that like I don't even see like my experiences or whatever even represented by this like discourse. So it's not even good at like pretending to represent a breadth of like experiences that people have. It's just this kind of weird exclusionary um, rhetoric or ideas. And I feel that more and more with music, like now where there's a lot of underground artists who I feel like are making things that are just as interesting, if not better, than often what gets covered by music websites. And they're not really acknowledged as part of the music sphere or doing anything that is of any real relevance or significance. Then I have to like, just, I don't know, I'm kind of disgusted about that. Like I knew this, somebody I know on Twitter was posting this meme about like, like avant-garde young kid album preferences. And it was like, it was supposed to be a joke that was like making fun of like a stupid hipster or whatever, who liked Yeezus more than My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, or like who like, it was always like you like the second Weird album more than the critically acclaimed one. And I'm like, I agree with like half of these. This is supposed to be a joke, but it's like, yeah. And the fact that like people present it as uh like, oh my God, like it's so silly that somebody would think this. This is too far. It's like, no, it's not too far. Let's go. Let's like go to that place in the distance that's far down there, and like really think about it. I don't know, because like that's the whole thing with like someone like Kanye West. Like he's totally politically just doesn't totally insulated, like has, lots of bizarre opinions, is this kind of sort of trolly facet of like popular culture. But when he says that like he is taking chances in the public sphere to a degree that other people aren't, like he's right, or I at least think that he's right. And like I think that oftentimes these fears are defined by how conservative people are and how little people are willing to go sort of past their bubble or their sort of insulated world, and to engage with the idea that like maybe this idea that I have about reality is incredibly complicated or contradicted by this thing that I wasn't aware of. And yeah.
It's interesting to me because I guess I would say a surprising amount of critical discussion feels like consensus mongering, if I'm describing what you've been describing,
Mm.
right? So it's like it would be one thing if you went onto it would be one thing if you went onto a Super Mario World. No, let's not use Super Mario. Let's stick with Kanye for a second. It would be if you went to a website.
It's
If you went to
either
like a
Super
full
Mario World or
world
Kanye.
of
It's it's
Kanye, right?
it's one
If you went
one or the other.
if you went to a Yeezus fan forum and went in and said Yeezus fucking sucks, and everyone turned on you, or like, or even you know what? Let's use My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy since that's more of a consensus album. Like, if you went
Hmm.
to a My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy fan site and went into the forums and were like, "Yo, this album fucking sucks." If everyone turned on you, like the context would explain it. It's like, "Oh right, I posted this at a fan site for the thing that I have some contrarian take on." But the weird thing is that you'll get that exact reaction if you just post it like in a general community of music critics, right? There is this need, there is this harsh and impulsive need to draw lines in the sand that seems so out of touch with what criticism even is and what you would assume that would would draw a person to want to be a critic or want to be around critics in the first place, right? Like, why would anyone want to be a critic just to reinforce like stale critical narratives about things that were established in a lot of cases before they were even born? But that's how a lot of, I don't know, I do feel like that's how a lot of mainstream critical communities operate. They're just sort of asserting and reasserting things that they assume everyone already or most people already clearly believe about a thing. And that thing could be My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, or it could be Super Mario World, or it could be Drake, or it could be any number of
Hmm.
capital P popular things.
Well, okay. So when people call you or me cynical, for contradicting, because I know that that's the thing that you get called sometimes, and that's the thing that like people are like, "Wow, you're so cynical, Liz."
Well, I get called a hater. I get called a
Yeah.
hater. I think
Okay.
I think that's the specific term I get. But cynical too, sure.
Like, what is more cynical than putting yourself into a career where you're basically subscribing to a consensus and your main role is to maintain and defend that consensus? Like, isn't that the most fucking cynical thing ever? In my mind, it is.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. Especially because in a lot of times, like that consensus, I would say in the post like BuzzFeed critical ecosystem, right? It's like that consensus in 99% of cases is the consensus that whatever faction of the recorded music industry wants you wants the consensus to be. So it's not even like enforcing consensuses that are legitimately like rebellious or anything. It's just like enforcing consensus that's mostly just like friendly to big record labels and like massively revenue generating artists. That's
And
what's
and
sort of
yeah,
annoying about
and
it.
and there's very little interrogation on that. And I think maybe that's part of it is like we need to preserve this culture attitude. And like we need to preserve this culture this from the wilds of the internet that are going to corrupt everything and make everything into memes or whatever. Um, maybe that's part of it. That's like it's like a conservative sort of mindset. It's also like a we don't want just anyone to get involved. You have to live in New York to, to get involved. I don't know. Like I mean this happens in other fields too. Like I'm thinking about one example in video games. There's like this game called Shovel Knight that's like a very critically acclaimed sort of retro throwback platformer. But I
Yeah.
had multiple people be like, "Oh, the level design in that game is really good," and like, no, it's not. It's not. It's not good. It's not a good game. It's an okay game. It's not good. I don't really think the level design is good. But like, and yeah, if you challenge that idea among certain people, they'll be like, no, you're wrong. Like you're crazy. So it happens like in all spheres, but I think video games are a little bit more chaotic. um, Although it does still sort of tend towards let's defend this big franchise or this big company, and uh, there's more variable takes on something that's smaller, but the bigger something is, the more people want you to have a consensus on it. And the only way that you can really challenge it is by saying it's like sexist or racist or
You're
whatever.
right,
That's
right. That part is totally true. That's the only way to sort of short circuit. Oh God, that is true.
which I could just be like, no, it's bad. It's not sexist or racist particularly, or maybe it is like
But
in
right.
a limited way. But the reason why it's bad is, it's not well designed or it's not terribly inspired, and maybe the critical landscape just decided to recognize it because that's just what there was or whatever. I mean, I feel that way about like that whole post-punk revival New York scene from like the early 2000s, like the Strokes and stuff. Like I hate most of those bands. Um,
Fair.
but but like music critics like as a whole like really wanted to make that a thing, so it became a thing.
I'm glad you brought up Shovel Knight because you were mentioning before that just compared to last year, there's sort of slim pickings a little bit with newish video games. But I will say a second thing that sort of led me to not play as much this year is, so for instance with Shovel Knight, I guess was last year is when I would have played it on Switch, and I avoided it. And I started having this spidey sense that now I have with regard to all games, like including God of War, which is thinking like if it seems like the sort of top level gaming discourse is really into a game, I just I lower my eyes a bit and I'm like, I don't know. I bet this game actually secretly sucks. And I can't shake that now. I don't know. I don't know where it came from, but I just uh you're rubbing off on me, I feel like, is what's happening
No,
here.
I think you're right. I mean, but it's my like,
That's why I avoided God
cult-like
of War.
influence.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
I mean,
But I
like
have this impulse all the time where it's just like I'll look at the game that it seems like the gaming consensus is rallied around, and I can't even articulate it sometimes, but it's just like, I don't know. I bet this is some bullshit.
I mean, I was around game stuff enough to where I tried to like dig my feet into the ground a little bit more and like make a thing about it. And I think people were more interested in hearing that maybe at a certain point than they are now. I don't know what's changed exactly. I think like the culture itself feels like it's bigger. There's a lot more people. It's not as small. It's not as small like the people who are having the conversations. And like Gamergate happened, so now like I mean, and this is another way that like I feel like society is echoing things that happened in like the gaming sphere, in that like I feel like the ways that people are reacting to Trump are sort of the ways that I saw people react to Gamergate. um, it's a little it's different obviously, but yeah, like I don't think things necessarily got better at all. um, and people just got weirdly more freaked out and defensive about stuff and sort of doubled down on things. And yeah, I don't know. It's kind of bleak to me in that like there are last year especially I felt like there were so many cool games and stuff that were coming out that just sort of passed by. And that's definitely not going to be the case for forever, especially, as um, because of the market saturation and everything else, people have less money in general to spend on these things. The dedicated gaming audience is going to prioritize, you know, something like Far Cry 5 even if they don't like it. Like that's the thing, like I've seen so many people who don't like that game who are playing like this is my second time playing through Far Cry 5. It's it's self-care.
Right. Right.
I have to care for myself by like consuming
Hate
this thing
playing.
that I don't really like.
Yeah.
Because I have to have opinions about it because I have to feel validated by having opinions about it online. And if I have opinions about this other thing that is maybe more deserving, that doesn't matter because I'm not validated by having opinions about that. Because if I post about it, no one's going to care because it's not in the discourse or whatever.
I will say, and I avoided Far Cry 5 as well. That discourse was disappointing in a weird roundabout way to me because it was like, oh, well, finally games journalism brings its actual critical faculties to bear on a game, but only because in a very obvious blunt way the game has like bad politics, right? It's sort of what you were saying
Hmm.
before of like, well, that's the only way in which you can sort of short circuit uh, what otherwise seems like kind of mindless and or arbitrary standing for bullshit is like if you just make it clear that a thing has bad politics, then people can work up their critical faculties and sort of pan it.
And that's one of the issues I have because sometimes something with bad politics can be like wonderful. Like I said, my favorite Kanye West song, and this is like probably to be a contrary opinion, is that song "I'm in It," because it's
I love
like,
it.
yeah, because it's so messed up. Like the lyrics are like weirdly racist. Like they're not like that line about Asian.
The sweet and sour sauce line and the civil rights
Yes.
sign line are both on that song.
Yes. And it's like I think it actually is trying to be sexy at some level, but it's not. It's like weirdly gross. It's like it doesn't sound like, it doesn't sound like so many popular songs like maybe are a little gross about how they try to be sexy, but like there's nothing like sexy about this track. It's just kind of like a horror movie. Um, and I don't know if it's even self-aware or not. It's really hard to say. Um, but it's like for me, it's like the perfect embodiment of like all the horrifying and compelling things about Kanye West's character, his persona.
Right.
Um, and it's like also more musically interesting than a lot of other things. Like, like one of his most well-known and well-regarded songs is the song Runaway, but then it has like a 5-minute part where he's just going, and like,
That was great. I really liked that. I liked your cover of Runaway on this podcast.
well, like he probably was singing that because like auto-tune can make anything sound good.
Right.
He's not a singer. That's okay. Not everyone's a singer. It's fine. Um, but like that, and that's something that like you bring up, people will be like, "Ew, no, like I don't want to acknowledge this. Like this is awful. Like actually, that and weirdly reactionary that you would be uh reappropriating the imagery of like civil rights or whatever in this. Oh, and that same album also, Blood on the Leaves,
Right.
which is like, you think it's going to be like this meaningful song about race relations in America, or like, how things aren't any different now than how they used to be, and it's about like how ex-wives can be bad.
Right. I think those two songs are the best songs on that album. I think I'm in it and Broadway's are the best songs.
Yeah, well, and it's because it's interesting, and the reason it's interesting
Right.
is it reveals something about his character, and like in a way that's like, no, you can't take this on its surface, because if you take this on its surface, it's kind of like, and people like really want to interpret it and like want to like be like, okay, this is like meaningful in some other way, because if you read it on his face, it's like, wow, this is really weird and kind of messed up. But like I feel like we should be like acknowledging that and engaging with that, like with any sort of popular figure, um because I think like great art doesn't necessarily it doesn't instruct you on how to live. It doesn't even necessarily provide, I mean, sometimes it provides a cathartic experience that you can really connect to emotionally, but our idea that you have to identify with something is really messed up, and I feel like it makes it, our ways of interpreting and looking at media, kind of our priorities are messed up because there are things like that that are weirdly more insightful in a way, but like obviously you can't identify with the protagonist, and that complicates like, uh Kanye West is a public figure, and it complicates so many things. But I that's just really like a case study for me. But like I think it's like, especially as like somebody who, I'm like a critic and I'm also trying to understand like something about these things that aren't reflected by popular discourse or whatever. I tend to find moments like that like way more telling than, the full, you know, when things are like supposedly fully realized, or in this ideal form where you can identify with it and whatever.
Right. I mean, I think that's what I would broadly describe as the tyranny of relatability that I think really defines a lot of 21st century American popular culture, right? Is that it's that very hard-coded, I mean, I guess in rap music, right? Like if you think of the biggest rap careers of the 21st century so far, it is Kanye and Drake. And those are two artists who specifically just to 11, their whole thing is that it's not just that they make great songs, but it's they're gaming this millennial relatability index, and the whole point of those songs, in a lot of cases, even at Kanye's most antisocial, and even at Drake's dweebiest, is that you're supposed to identify with those personas, and I do not like that as a place where, because I think that plays into a lot of other things, right? Like it's why it's easy to reduce an artist and their art down to their politics. It's why it's why it's hard for it's why I think it's hard for a lot of artists to take risks, right? Because you're responsible for managing this sort of umbilical cord that connects you to the fan, and the thing that the fan is looking for is this sort of perfect, if still universal, recreation of themselves in you as an avatar. I mean, it's very video gamey in a way, but
Mm-hmm.
it just seems like an unhealthy, especially like once you get deep enough into the 21st century and it feels like artists are gaming that relatability index, and it just feels like so much art is being made not to be sort of formally or technically impressive, but rather it's just being made to be like, don't you see yourself in this? And it's just like,
Yeah.
I do not. Escapism, the idea of like escapism as a place, as a thing I do just to confront myself is like weird. I find that bizarre,
Well,
and I don't like
and
it.
the number one complaint about the sort of popular charts, the popular music in 2016 and 2017, or sorry, 2017, 2018. God, I don't know what time it is. Um, is that like it's all this like weirdly mellow stuff with no real hooks, and it sounds like so just sedate and kind of like all this like weird mood music that isn't really necessarily well conceived. Maybe acts as like, you know, this like come down from the chaos of like our culture and society. But I think of that in terms of like Drake songs. It's like he's not even like that song God's Plan. Like he's not even trying in that song. Like it's still like a decent hook, but like it's not necessarily like well conceived. I wouldn't say. I mean, not that music has to be. Um,
Yeah, that shift
but
is interesting because it's like if last decade the biggest rappers on earth were like Joe Budden and Devin the Dude, right? Like it's just the apotheosis of depressive and or very artfully low effort. It's just
yeah, or
it's
I'm
funny.
I mean, that's the aesthetic. I mean, I like that. I know you don't like Frank Ocean. I like that Frank Ocean album from what is
Blonde
it
or
called?
endless? Which one?
Blonde,
Okay.
Blonde. I like got into that, but that's the aesthetic of that album too, very much. That album does. I mean, I feel like that album does a better job of capturing it, but it does have that like that is that kind of tossed off mellow thing. Um, I think that is like the aesthetic of the past few years, which is kind of weird. I don't know. I don't relate to a lot of the stuff that you're supposed to identify with either. So I have a hard time with that. Maybe it's just my like ways of engaging with stuff is a little different. But it's also frustrating because um, you kind of risk people reading things so much literally if you're like a musician or really any sort of artist doing anything that seems like it might be. Well, I mean, people assume something is autobiographical almost no matter what from a musician. But like, um, if you're singing as a character and maybe the character is kind of messed up, like then people tend to uh, assume that that's you, you or whatever, and it can be really hard to actually um, like actually see the art for what it is because I mean a lot of my favorite musicians may or may not be good people. I don't know. I don't know who they are, but may make music that sounds really messed up. Like I think one of the reasons why I like Death Grips is because it's not relatable. Like it's just like it's dramatized. It's like the Nicolas Cage of of music or whatever.
Jesus Christ, the Nicholas. That's my sense of like of Jedi mind tricks, right? Like I remember when I was in college and got into Jedi mind tricks. I think it was that exact same process in my head of like I like this specifically because of how out of touch I feel with it, right? Like it's accessible to me on a highly abstracted level of like music you listen to and you have a lot of anxiety and it helps you sort of process that anxiety and vent because it's all just like violent and vulgar.
Hmm.
But it's also like, well, I hope these people aren't like serial killers. Like I hope Benito Paz isn't like murdering people, you know what I mean? To the degree that it sounds like he would if he's anything like his music.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well,
but
and
that's a
that's
real
the
thing, and that's totally
yeah.
that's a dynamic that's kind of I don't want to. Obviously, people aren't stupid, but I just mean in a general sense, it feels like a dynamic that's totally lost on 2010's popular culture and arts criticism, right? Because yeah, there is a sort of weird literalism that kicks in among critics now and among just sort of consumers now, where it's like you said, it's the extreme end of people taking music as autobiography. And I
Yeah,
don't,
I think that's always kind of been the case though, honestly. It just like is maybe heightened in a particular way now. I don't know.
yeah,
I feel like in our culture in particular in the West and in the US in particular, excuse me. Um it is like that is the default mode of operation as a like, I remember showing a friend Blade Runner and they were like, I don't like this. I can't relate to the characters. And I was like, yeah, I know. Like you don't like I don't like Harrison Ford's character in that movie either.
yeah.
Or like The Shining or something. I don't know. Those are two of my favorite movies with no relatable character. I guess The Shining has Scatman Crothers, but then he gets killed.
I will
Um,
say it's like I'm black, and I think in general when I was a kid I would have that reaction to, or even when I was in college I would have that reaction to, let's say, white movies all the time. Like I
mhm.
don't relate to any of these people, so maybe I'm just used to that. Like I don't know. That's a thing that it's. I guess different people have different levels of like how much relatability is like crucial to their ability to really patch into a a piece of artwork. But I've
Yeah,
just like
so
not related to things my whole life, I guess.
yeah, like people watching like Friends or like Sex in the City or something and being like, that's me, that horrifies me. That horrifies me. But if it's from the angle of like, wow, these people are weird, like what is this? Like what are these like values that these people have? That's actually more interesting to me because then you can
Correct.
like, and like I've heard that I've heard that like Friends is inexplicably popular in the UK right now. But maybe part of it is that's like it has this like comfort of a sitcom, but the characters are just alien enough to to people in the UK to where they're like, they like it more or whatever.
Right.
This dude who I've had on this podcast before, Doc Future, made this YouTube video which is really wonderful about it's an alphabetical list of black characters that appear in Friends. Uh, and it's like pretty much all of the like black guest stars that have ever appeared in Friends. Um, and what I find interesting about it is like he like does this thing where he references memes or things from other videos or things that are very specific and very insular to pop culture. And then we'll make another video about it, but there's no like explicit reference to that other thing. Like, um, he did like a song cover version of like this specific thing that's in a Friends episode that like appears. But I didn't know that that was like a reference until like later, because there's no sort of context for it or whatever. But I liked that because like he has like again like an outsider perspective. Like I think he actually genuinely likes Friends. Um, and he adds, but I think he has this like outsider perspective on it that is like makes it more interesting to me than if I were trying to watch this and relate to it. Because I watched that show as a kid when it came on, like after The Simpsons or whatever, but I was always like, this show is weird. Like, I don't really like these people.
I watched it obsessively. I watched Friends obsessively as a kid. But I did. I watched it with that sense of specifically the only character on Friends that was super accessible to me, although I think I grew up to be more like Chandler, was Joey. Joey was the one character where I was like, oh, okay, this is the this is the grounded main character for me. It's this guy
That's funny.
obsessed with food. Like, it's kind of dumb. I was like, all right, I get this guy. The rest of these people are weird, but I get Joey.
Yeah, I what a show.
What
What a time.
a time. Oh my God. Pre 9/11. This is a whole different country before 9/11, culturally speaking.
Yeah, I actually I had I'm having this moment now with music actually where I'm going back and I'm enjoying like so I had like and I don't realize how much I think I sort of fit into the trends of like the 2010s by doing this, but I had this period where I transitioned and like was dealing with sort of seeing reality in a different way. So I'm like starting to be like, okay, I should finally like listen to like Tori Amos or whatever and like take this stuff seriously and not like, be afraid to listen to it. And so I got really into like, I mean, I first got really into like Kate Bush and Tori Amos and Bjork and like a few other artists, but then like from there I'm like, okay, well, I kind of like electronic music, so like let's listen to Aphex Twin or whatever. And then from there, I'm like, okay, well, I kind of see the connection from like electronic music into like hip hop music. So I'll listen to that like some more, or I kind of understand the appeal of pop music now. So I'll listen to that. But, but now a lot of like pop music is so, kind of bleak and uninspired that I'm kind of going back to like, wow, I kind of miss talking about this like, weird silly indie band from like the 2000s because uh while like they were like super white guys who like oftentimes it's like this like weird utopianism or whatever that I don't relate to. Like one group that I've been listening to a lot recently is Animal Collective, and like I do like their music a lot up to a certain point, but I don't necessarily like a lot of things about their what they represent or their fan base or whatever. But going back and listening to it, it's like, oh wow, this music is actually kind of weird, and it's cool that like music websites were all over this, even though there are elements of that that are whatever. Because that's what seems so bizarre to me, that there would be this critical consensus now about music that is kind of so weird or idiosyncratic or whatever, and is on like an indie label, isn't wildly popular, because I feel like that's missing from because that kind of music, I still see it come out, but I don't see it like widely accepted or widely embraced in the way that maybe some of those artists that were a little bit kind of alternative or off the beaten path like were. So like I'm almost like at this point where I'm like regressing, or at least trying to like see the appeal in these things that I had like in the last 7 or 8 years decided to dismiss, and So that's been interesting. I don't know where I was going with that, but I think it's like indicative of how much like landscapes change.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Maybe that's why
Um,
that is probably like in general, as I sort of switch back and forth between being like, I'm gonna write about politics. No, I'm gonna write about video games. No, 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 I'm gonna write about music again. No, I'm just gonna write about like Atlanta, and then just doing that in cycles is because like I don't know, it's like this sense of landscapes are always changing, and I've never really known where I fit ideally. Like I don't have this sense of like, oh, I have this overwhelming expertise in this particular field that makes it such that like if I'll camp out here and write enough and research enough and talk to enough people in this one field that I'll write authoritatively. Like I don't really have any sense of authoritativeness about me, right? Like I mostly write with this sense of I either write with the sense of like I'm just looking for an excuse to spend time with the subject and maybe talk to people about things and then
mm,
produce some journalism about it, or I'm writing with the sense of moral clarity about a thing that doesn't even necessarily require the wonkiest of historical expertise so much as it just requires somebody to have, I think, clear-minded ethics about a thing that people otherwise are having sort of like convoluted and non-confrontational ethics about. But yeah, I think the consequence of that is I never really know where I fit, where I should fit, where I would ideally platonically fit in the current media landscape. And I don't know if that's like a good thing of like being adaptable or whether I'm creating like a weird ceiling for myself.
well, I think it's a short term versus a long term gain because like a lot of careers online are very directed towards the short term, and the way to build like a short term audience is to concentrate very particularly on one thing, on one subject, on one sort of like discipline or whatever, and present yourself as an expert on that. But then you run the risk of that thing suddenly not being popular anymore, or the discourse sort of shifting around it, and then you're kind of in a place where you're like you kind of have to invent reasons for people to care about, whatever you're writing about, which a lot of people certainly have. Um, and the other side of that is the long term thing, which is like saying like, well, the more that I interact with these aspects of culture, the more that I see how they intersect with each other, and trying to be more of a generalist, like acknowledging those things. There's like that's not something that is encouraged by the structures of the internet. But I do think it's a way to preserve your sanity maybe a little bit more. Um, because you're a little bit more aware of how these things are intersecting with each other.
Yeah.
So I think it's like I think more people should be thinking about long term. Like, okay, here's one example. Like, if you were a critic, if you're worried about society and culture going the way that it's going, and like the world being annihilated and all that kind of stuff that people are anxious about today. Um, One thing that you can do, like especially if you're a critic or someone like that, is to kind of stake out your own territory and be like, look, I'm gonna try and make something new. Like I'm gonna try and like sort of create a new way of looking at this issue, or like sort of make a new category, or sort of recontextualize things in a way that no one else has done before. And for me, like I got into games doing that at a time when that was a part of the norm, to some extent. And part of that was the like Silicon Valley, like we need to disrupt everything kind of attitude. But like, and that's the thing, that's how they suck people in, because there's no other aspects of society where that idea is prevalent, where that idea of like, I have this one really good new idea, and I'm going to change society with it. I'm going to change the world. Like Silicon Valley really like brings those people in. I mean, it's totally like a cynical business, especially at this point. Um, But I feel like we should like take that idealism and put it towards something else. And like, the obvious is like, community organizing and all that kind of stuff. But
Nope, it's going to the
the
moon. We're going to the moon. It's not community organizing. We're going to the moon. That is
exactly.
it.
But the less obvious is because media is like our culture, like and people see themselves through media, so organizing, changing the way that people conceptualize reality is part of that. It's not the only part of that. It's not like one of those things where it's not like that attitude of like, if you change art to be this fully in touch art, it will somehow magically change people's minds and make them less reactionary or like, whatever. Like art can like awaken people to that stuff, but it has to happen in the context of a bunch of other things. But the other side is like the realities aren't just like these hard statistical political realities, and giving people hope through just changing the ways that you're approaching and thinking about things, and making sort of new territories or paths or inventing a new language is a way to do that. And I definitely aspire to do that. And there is a lot of hostility towards doing that. And there's also a lot of like this attitude of like, well, no one's paying attention to like, no one will pay attention to my writing if I do that. And I guess the like response that I would have to that is like if if you're part of like the sphere of popular discourse, like what you write is generally of so little consequence anyway. And like especially if you're part of a conversation that a lot of people are having, a lot of people are framing things a certain way. Uh, um, Doing this thing where you're kind of cynically just trying to get through and stay on top of an issue, um, by echoing whatever consensus, maybe in a slightly different way, is one of the most cynical things imaginable. And like, you might as well like try something different. You might as well like actually try to take on something that maybe people aren't going to read. Like, fuck it, maybe no one's going to read it, but at least you started it. Like, at least you did it. And like, I don't see enough of that. Like, cause that's what starts things. Like, and that's why I wrote like a fucking piece that took me ages about a fucking Russian Doom mod, because like no one else was going to start that sort of conversation, and maybe not that many people read it. But the more that you sort of put those things out there, I have seen how those things can change culture. And um I think like people need to understand that they actually do have like responsibility and power even within their like limited spheres. I'm sorry to get all uh philosophical or whatever, but this is
You should put
something.
music on the background of it. It's very inspirational, right?
Yeah.
You should.
Like every episode of this podcast has turned into me giving an inspirational speech at the end of it.
Listen, it's good. It's helpful. We're supporting each other through positive podcasting.
I was gonna like ask you about that Childish Gambino thing, but I felt like I didn't want to broach it right away, because it's like, again, it's like an issue that like everyone has to have opinions about.
No, let's talk about it. What about Childish Gambino in particular?
Well, I found it funny that like I remember in like 2013 or 14 he like made this post that like social media activism is whack. And like a lot of people were like, yeah, whatever, man, you're stupid. And then like, and then Atlanta came out and people, sort of changed their takes on him. And like also his music, like I feel like the perception of his music was a lot more mixed, and a lot of people didn't even know what to think of it, at a certain
I will
point in the
say,
past.
well, I'll say that like unlike what we were saying about Taylor Swift earlier in our convo, where that was just it felt like totally revisionist takes happened overnight. I don't even think there's been a revisionism with Donald Glover so much as there's just suddenly a know-nothingism about him, where it's just like everyone, especially anyone who's like anyone who has access and is like a profile writer and writing about this guy, they basically are laboring under this like maybe unstated, maybe stated agreement to just pretend that 2010 to 2015 Donald Glover never happened. Right? Like that seems to be it. It's not even
Well,
revisionism so much as it's just he was erased
yeah.
from the Jedi archives.
Well, and then he appeared in Star Wars, and then
Right,
everything's
yeah.
okay because he's in Star Wars.
Right,
I
right.
mean, I feel like that's often how these things work. Like, I, it is funny to me the amount of people who care about Janelle Monáe now, and I wonder if it's just because she was in a few big movies. I don't know. I like her I like her music. But she's somebody who I almost found more interesting. I don't want to be a hipster about this. I almost found her more interesting as a figure before she got like super duper famous.
See,
Um,
I have the opposite take on Janelle, which is that I really just in an almost shameful sense, found her music boring until Dirty Computer. I just I spent a lot of time uh, trying to convince myself that I liked the previous two Janelle projects, and they just never actually did. They just sort of sat in my
mm.
iTunes library for like long periods of time.
Well, it's a little bit more. It's like the problem that a lot of artists. I feel like it's a little bit too detailed. Like it's a little bit too flowery musically.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit too like virtuosic or whatever. I feel like that's an often a thing that artists have like earlier in their careers. Um, that like things are a little bit more flowery and complicated before they strip
Streamlined.
down.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think Solange had that exact problem where it's like you can tell like Solange has a lot of musical knowledge, but I feel like Solange's albums before the one she put out last year, maybe it was 2 years ago at this point, were just like, yeah, there's too much going on here. I gotta step away from this. And yet the one where I'm like, oh, I finally get Solange is the one that feels very focused,
Hmm.
you know?
Well, and that's
Um,
a yeah, that's a common thing. I mean, that like that's true of like Kate Bush's music is kind of like that. It gets more stripped down the further you go into it. Or David Bowie is another example. Like his early music is very like 8 million chord changes, and then he just turned more into like weird dance-ish music. But um, I kind of have mixed feelings about David Bowie in general. But anyway, um, the thing with him that I found kind of funny is like, yeah, I like when Atlanta came out, I tried to get into him and I watched like some old special about him and he made some like gross, rape joke. Um, which is like, common for like every comedian. But I was just like, okay, he's just another comedian then. And like I watched Atlanta and there was like one episode like about like there was like of some beef with like a trans person
in
and
the
I
first
turned it
season.
off.
Yeah, in that first
Yeah,
season, yeah.
it was like the fifth episode, sixth episode, something like that. And I like turned it off like at the beginning. And then I heard like later on that episode, there's like some resolution there. But like, I think I was like maybe overreacted a little bit. But, when I see like a comedy show trying to deal with trans issues in general, I tend to be like, oh no, this is going to be bad. um, but I think the thing that I find funny about this is how like impeccable his timing was with like releasing that video after sort of everyone became disillusioned with Kanye West.
Right.
Um, because everyone's like immediately like, okay, Don, it's Donald Glover now. Like he knows like, and the thing is like I actually really like that video. Like, and it was clear that like people didn't really know what to think about it. Like when it came out, because I saw like more negative takes like the first day and then the second day, like people were like analyzing it. And then I saw all these like really positive takes about it. And I was kind of, I mean, I think his sensibilities are pretty like cinematic in general, and like the music fits well with that. And I don't know, like I think I was just enjoying the fact that there was something that not everybody had the same feelings about that people were
Yeah.
talking about. Because it's like I can relate to that of being like you know, I'm in the space where my relationship with like the trans community is, or the queer community is extremely complicated, and I have a feeling the things that I do might piss a lot of people in the trans or queer community off, but then also make other people feel like their rage is being realized. But the other side of that is that, yeah, there is like an element of that. It's kind of like weird, empty reactionary trolling too. So I don't really know, but I guess I enjoyed with that whole spectacle that, something that is, there is something that is provoking people in a way that is like not provoking this like universal love. Um, I don't know. What was your take on that?
Oh, I mean, it's weird. I don't know that I have a take. I don't know that I have a super strong take on the video or the song itself. I mean, my sort of basic take is that I think the song is good, and I think the video is certainly think the video is captivating. The people who reacted to it with the sense of this is offensive, I definitely that was not my the first couple of times watching it. That was not my reaction to it. I feel like I understand. I feel like I understand where people are coming from with that
Mm.
on some level, but yeah, I didn't think he, unlike a Kanye, like I didn't think he was just trolling. I didn't think he was invoking, images of the Charleston massacre, for instance, as like a
Yeah.
stunt. It
No.
wasn't in the spirit of Yeezus. It was in the spirit
No,
of Kendrick, if anything. Like
yeah.
it's more
Yeah, no.
Kendrick than Yeezus.
It's more like actually has something to say.
Right. But I also
Uh,
think it's you're right about the timing. Like it's the timing is. I mean, he was always scheduled to perform as an SNL, Saturday Night Live, that date, and I guess that release was always pegged to the Saturday Night Live hosting gig that Donald Glover did. But yeah, there's a weird quality to how for the past month Kanye let everyone down, and it's almost comical, the idea that like Kanye turning into like a right-wing grandpa who spends too much time on YouTube disappointed everyone in ways that I assumed would teach everyone a lesson about the political significance and the political credibility we imbue in random celebrities. And instead of learning that lesson, people just sort of immediately cast about for a different celebrity to vomit all of that political significance onto. And they found it in Donald Glover. I guess the thing about the timing of the video, it's like the timing of Donald Glover hosting SNL, Donald Glover being his own musical guest, Donald Glover premiering 2 new songs on SNL, and then him releasing the This Is America video, right? Like this all happens in one weekend. It happens in a weekend that's like the weekend where people are probably the most exasperated by this point, with Kanye sort of tweeting obsessively about like Candace Owens and Jordan Peterson. And like there's a sense in which I think people maybe look at Donald Glover and Kanye and think, oh, well, they're interesting black auteurs. And sure, but like Janelle Monáe is interesting in similar ways. Beyonce is in similar way is similar in those
well,
ways.
yeah. You're an auteur if you're a guy.
Right, that's the thing. Right, that's exactly it. Right, there's this sort of it's not people. I think explicitly talk about it as if they just want um, the black successor to Kanye, but what they really want is a sort of cynical, rude, black male, capital G genius figure to, I think, serve as this bridge between black culture and white culture. And I don't know, the thing that Kanye and Donald Glover have in common, as far as I see it, the thing that they really have in common on a sort of subliminal wavelength is this sort of obsession with, they have an obsession with white culture, right? Like they have an obsession with white culture and with white validation in ways that a Janelle Monáe does not, or Beyonce does not. Like Jay-Z doesn't have
Mhm.
that quality, right? The person who has that quality that Kanye has where he's obsessed with white people, is Donald Glover. And Donald Glover's rebranding has pretty much sort of purged that from his narrative. But it's a thing that I think beneath the surface people recognize about him. And they know that for every measure of satire and sort of scathing political critique of whiteness Donald Glover offers, they know that in reality, Donald Glover isn't really going to hurt white people. Like, Donald Glover's not really going to, he's not really going to challenge white people, but so much. In the same way that, like, Kanye's the guy who announced at a telethon that George Bush doesn't care about black people. But it was also always the case that you knew that Kanye was obsessed with white people, and he was obsessed with Steve Jobs and Anna Wintour and Mark Zuckerberg all validating him in this way that he could say the craziest shit about George Bush and it doesn't matter because you know he's a guy who at the end of the day wants white audiences to love him and he wants to be compared to white people.
Well, and I think this is the general, the whole conversation comes back to the idea of like being legitimized through some sort of like, oh God, I'm gonna like quote the in that documentary, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology, that by Slavoj Žižek.
Yes.
He talks about this idea called the big other, which is like basically that there's this sort of benevolent force out there that that you're speaking to, that is like that I don't know, that has like that has the best interests of the public in mind or whatever, that there's like this invented idea of that a lot of people, I feel like I felt this way when like the thing about Grimes dating Elon Musk is a lot of celebrities fucking love tech entrepreneurs because they present this idea that this like different sort of reality is possible in a way that I feel like is kind of cynical and like very, you know, business oriented or whatever. But the way to legitimize yourself in society, like, is by sort of taking on the traits or whatever of like, you know, whatever dominant group in culture that you're not part of. So like Elon Musk is dating Grimes because he's a fucking dork and people don't think that tech people are humans and not just robots. So it's probably like a partially calculated move on his part to like, you know, date a celebrity who's more glamorous or whatever. And on the flip side, someone like Kanye West like really desperately doesn't want to be seen as an entertainer. He wants to be like an entrepreneur because that's the way that you are taken seriously. But like there's this idea that there's this some validation that comes from these things. But if you like, I mean, if you hang out with like tech entrepreneurs, like you actually like hang around those people are just like so insufferable. Like they like there isn't any like sort of changing the world or transforming society that's really happening there. There might have a handful of good ideas, but like there isn't this like, you know, genius insight that is somehow missing or whatever. And I think that like, especially if you come from a particular marginalized group, you come from a certain background, you might think that like, you know, the dominant culture or the dominant sort of, the dominant group have the answers to these things that you lack or whatever, or like that are missing. And like, unfortunately, the answer in reality is they don't. Like, there's no like legitimization to be had. Like, we actually, part of the reason that our world is so fucked up is that our priorities and values are not really echoing reality, and they're not really echoing like how things actually play out in reality and the things that we value. So like putting on those things is not something that you should be striving to do, but I understand why somebody in that situation who really wants to, be taken seriously in a way that other people aren't, would do that because like being trans, it's also like trans people are so not visible in popular culture that if I were ever even visible at all, then it feels like, to a wider audience, then it feels like this massive, big validation thing because you're doing something that maybe hasn't been done before in that way. But at the same time, like that validation is kind of silly because it doesn't really it doesn't really reach so many people who are doing things that are actually changing society and culture for the better, who will probably never be acknowledged. So yeah, I guess that's my thought on that.
It does feel like, even since we're talking about Elon and Kanye again and Grimes, it's like those people all do, as much as they seem like this cast of characters that stand like far over us, they also just seem trapped in like how you're describing Kanye. They're as lost in the sauce as anyone else, and they are trapped in, like, it's weird that level, like if you think of it as an upper level of society, it's weird that being at that upper level of society really just, it doesn't actually give you an improved vantage. It doesn't really give you, it only seems, if anything, to further obscure like your sense of power and your sense of reality. And you end up, like you said, you end up being Kanye, wanting to be compared to and wanting to be branded as an entrepreneur for reasons that are probably totally mysterious and obscure to him personally, right? Like he doesn't actually, like, gaining influence and power has not given him insight on how to wield influence and power. It's just made him a more confused person.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like a very bad parable for the potential of ever reorienting American society from wanting to go to Mars to wanting to think about community organizers instead.
Well, maybe like my hope that I don't necessarily think will play out in any sort of short-term capacity is that people will be able to start identifying this pattern and realize that, like, oh, maybe this reflects culture or society at large. And as of yet, that kind of interrogation doesn't really happen.
By the way, that's the
And
weirdest. That is the weirdest, I will
yeah.
say, as a broad strokes thing. That is the weirdest element to me of working in media as a critic. It's like, you know what it feels like? It's like being trapped in a Scooby-Doo episode that never ends, right? Because it's sort of, you keep collecting clues to the things that are wrong with popular culture and how those faults in popular culture lead to faults in political culture. And it seems like so many different figures in so many different fields fail in some way or falter or disappoint us. And each time that happens, they're basically leaving a clue. But American society right now is like, we have like 2,000 clues at this point, but no one's really put any of the clues together. That's what it feels like. It's, it's like maybe the ways in which people had these hilariously blinkered and overinvested, overdetermined expectations of Kanye West politics, like maybe that has to do with the culture that also elected a game show host president. It's like maybe these things, maybe it's not just conservatives who are lost in the sauce. Like maybe the problem is America in general.
Yeah.
But people never think like
I
that. They always think like it is the children who are wrong, right? But it's it's someone else who's wrong, and the problem is isolated to some part of America. That the only thing we really know about it is that we just don't identify with it, or it's some faction that our main observation of it is that we don't identify with it, and that's
well,
weird.
Yeah, I guess what I would say, and we can really end here because I feel like it's a good place to end around this subject, is that I said this at the end of like the episode that I did with Felix Biederman too. I feel like culture is constantly changing, and there are some aspects of culture that have, become more and more like, we see stuff from the 90s that keeps popping up, like people, The Simpsons somehow has become a perpetual thing that exists, or there's a lot of different cases of that, but things always change, like, and I think the ways that we look at these things and approach them will change, and eventually, especially as people become more tired and exhausted about how things are. And like, this is the kind of moment where, I mean, I think about like in music, how, the musical landscape was a certain way, and then like fucking Nirvana came out, and then like, hip hop became a bigger thing in like the early 90s, and that kind of thing really did actually change the culture a lot. And I think that kind of thing, I mean, it's happening more slowly and more gradually and more under the surface, but like there are these sorts of shifts that happen, and it's something is going to happen. Things are not always going to be the way that they are right now. And so we should like think about what kind of like future we want to like envision, and not get too stuck in the present, because a few years from now we're probably not going to be thinking about this. I mean, most people didn't remember that Donald Glover said that social media activism is whack or whatever. Like, people don't remember that kind of stuff, for the most part. I mean, people probably remember Kanye wearing the Trump hat, but the point is that like things change all the time, and like it's important to like have that perspective. And even in our current like geo hell, like there are many things that are going to happen before before the end.
Right. Oh God, it's like it's like the end of it's like the end of Persona 5. It's like, oh, I wish this would end, but it somehow gets worse and worse.
Thank you so much for being the second appearance of a person on this podcast, Justin.
No problem, Liz.
The Honorable Justin Charity.
Oh my God. Get out of here.
Did you have anything else you wanted to like say or plug or whatever?
No, not really. Listen to Damage Control. You hear me vent on my podcast with Kate Nebbs at The Ringer. But otherwise, I don't know, find me on Twitter. My name, Justin Charity, is my Twitter. I don't have a cool nickname anymore on Twitter. Or don't follow me on Twitter. I tweet pretty sporadically, and usually, I don't know, Liz, you should describe my tweets. My tweets are kind of like your tweets, I feel like. We tweet in a similar style.
Yeah, I tweet probably more. I like thread it, make threads
well, you
more.
be doing those threads.
Yeah.
I noticed your threads.
Yeah, but other than that, like, yeah, I would say, I don't know, like the fact that you tweet sporadically is a good endorsement, I would say. Anyway, thank you so much for being on.
No problem. Thanks, Liz.